So today, I have something really cool to show you guys. I have the data of all the hitboxes of every character model in Overwatch with pinpoint accuracy using the power of programming and 3D rendering. Now, if you know me, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but luckily there are some smart cookies in the community, and with the help of a person named Plus or Minus, he's done all the heavy lifting, and I take zero credit for his work here. I'm just using my platform to elevate his work. So the least you guys can do is subscribe to his channel so, more eyeballs can check out his work. It's really cool stuff. Anyway, so after speaking with him, this was all done using a workshop script that he wrote that calculates data points on a character model. He then extracted those numbers and interpreted them through Blender, a 3D rendering software to make these puffy Baymax Michelin man looking figures. And so for the nerds that are interested in the script and numbers, it's on the description. So you guys know me, I'm the tips and tricks for every hero guy, that's my shtick. So let's play the music and interpret hitboxes for every hero. Let's go. When shooting a diva, it's always important to remember that her head hitbox is that center cockpit. That means if you're the diva player in this case, you can angle yourself so only your side and back are facing the enemy if you don't have your defense matrix up to avoid being headshot. The most interesting part of this analysis is that her entire leg on the mech counts. Look at all that empty space, along with her shoulder pads. As a bonus, we also have the baby diva hitboxes available to see. Her head hitbox is fairly small, but don't be fooled by the lower half of her hair. The part that makes it difficult to hit is when she strafes, so you're better off trying to land those body shots unless you're insanely accurate. Orisa is a massive character. I mean, you guys knew that, even before seeing this hitbox data. She's super easy to hit, which is why she relies so heavily on her shield and fortify, or else she gets melted. The biggest takeaway from this is that her horns and her gun are not part of the hitbox. That's about it. Reinhardt's hitbox on his upper torso is pretty interesting because everything will hit. The only gap is actually between his legs, so if you're playing Ana, for example, you're safe aiming anywhere along his upper torso since it won't pass through under his arms, unlike his legs. Reinhardt's hammer is not part of the hitbox, and his head sits in front of his body, meaning that if his back is facing you at eye level, you cannot headshot him. Moving on to Roadhog's hitbox, it is also very forgiving when looking at him head on. The thick legs and everything makes him very hard to miss since it's quite short and stubby. His hook and scrap gun are not part of his hitbox. Unlike the other head hitboxes of the tanks, you can actually hit Roadhog's head from behind, although his giant shoulders block a quarter of it on each side. Sigma has some long legs and a large head hitbox, which is vulnerable at all angles. Not much to say here, just be careful of his shoulder pads as they are not part of it. Winston's hitbox is very unique. Since he stands on all fours and is slouched over, his head hitbox is not accessible from behind. These little wings are also part of his hitbox as well. Overall, his hitbox is very large and poofy. I mean, look at that giant hitbox on his chest and his back legs. Like, all of that is targetable, so it makes Winston really hard to miss. We also have hitbox data on his primal form, in which he is no longer slouching and is much more upright. His body hitbox is so wide that it covers the gaps between his arms, and his head hitbox is also enlarged quite a bit, making him once again hard to miss, unless you just whiff. It may be difficult to headshot him while he's jumping around and juggling another teammate, so a takeaway from this is to focus on body shots when his back is facing you so you don't waste your time going for the head at this angle. For Ball, don't be fooled by this. It looks weird because this is Ball when he's stationary, but when he's moving and shooting, the green hitbox outlines are still accurate. But it's very difficult to headshot Ball because his head is so small relative to his body, and if you miss left or right, you won't land any body shots, unlike the other tanks. With so much body shot surface area, just focus your aim there. It seems like half his cannon is still part of the hitbox as well, something else to keep in mind. And yes, when Ball is rolling around, his head hitbox is completely hidden along with his mechanical legs and arms. Who would have thought? Next we have Zarya, one of the smallest tanks in the game. Her head hitbox is large and targetable from all angles, front, side, and back. No part of her gun is in the hitbox. Her legs are spaced apart quite a bit, so you can miss your shots between there, but there is no gap under her armpits, so if you're a body shot bandit like me, aim in her upper half. Now that we've done all the tanks, let's look at their orthographic hitbox comparison just to see how it matches up with the other ones side by side. You can totally see how Zarya and Sigma are so small, and look how big all the tanks are, gosh. It looks like Winston's head and Roadhog's head at first glance here seems the largest, with D.Va's being quite surprisingly small. Take one last look at this as it rotates, and then we'll move on to the DPSs. For Ashe, her legs are very wide and spread apart, so be wary of that. The tail end of her coat that sticks out is not part of her hitbox, and her head hitbox is a giant sphere, so no matter what skin you're rocking that changes her hat, it will all connect, so don't be fooled by it. Bastion, while he's in recon standing form, has quite a cylindrical head hitbox, and his turret gun that's attached to his back counts as part of it, meaning you won't be able to land any headshots from behind. But realistically, you won't be fighting Bastion in this form very much, as he's usually in his turret form with his head crit box, the Tesseract, which is resting in the back, which means it's inaccessible from the front. It's like the literal opposite of his recon form. When Bastion uses ult in tank form, he no longer has a head hitbox whatsoever. Doomfist is just jacked, bro. His gigantic fists, shoulders, and quads have a lot of surface area, so he is quite easy to hit when he's not using his mobility cooldowns. He does slouch over a bit, so he will be difficult to headshot when his back is facing you, so just focus on body shots from that angle specifically. Not much else to it. Echo's hitbox is actually quite deceptive. Although she is quite skinny, her hitbox extends far beyond it. Few more important things to note is that her wings are indeed part of her hitbox, and this little upper part of her head is not. Genji's hitbox is fairly reasonable, nothing much to note other than his sword not being part of it. Now what's actually interesting is Genji's Deflect, and I know a lot of people are confused and have always wanted clarification on what the hitbox of it actually is. Basically, when Genji deflects, any bullet or projectile will deflect if it hits this sort of wall surrounding him. You can see that even if he's 90 degrees facing away from you, it will still deflect. When you get behind him though, this graphic shows how it goes transparent, which basically indicates the end of its range. If we look at it from another angle, it's kind of like a little cube container, but with some spacing in the back, which basically indicates that the side deflect hitbox is a bit longer than his back. You can also see that the top of his head counts as the deflect hitbox as well. The biggest takeaway from this is that the length of the hitbox extends far beyond Genji's player model, above and below him. However, the Z-axis, which is the distance between Genji and the deflect range, is quite short, so you can splash projectiles nearby him. Hanzo's hitbox is fairly reasonable as well. His legs and his shoulders are a little bit thicker on the hitbox than it is relative to his character model. His bow and quiver are not part of the hitbox, and that's about it. Just watch it rotate, boys. Just watch it rotate. Junkrat's hitbox is quite large, and he slouches over, making his head sit up front along with his giant rip tire in the back being part of the hitbox. Also look at his fake leg. It's a stick, but the hitbox says otherwise. And for a bonus, we have data on his trap. You ever just try to jump over one and still get snared? Well, if you look at this, you can see a small bit of vertical height on this bad boy, along with a little bit of forgiveness around the outside, so don't stand too close to one, even though it fully looks like you're not even on it. For McCree, I think his hitbox is way too big relative to his actual player model. You can see it's way beyond his arms and legs here. One thing I noticed when looking at this was his hat. It is definitely not part of his hitbox, as his true hitbox is that giant sphere over his head. So if you're a McCree player, I guess you could rock a different skin with a long bill on the hat to kind of fool the enemies, in hopes they accidentally shoot that part of the hat on your head, so they miss all their bullets and you slurp up all their SR and finally climb out of bronze. So for Mei, this is going to surprise a lot of you, but she actually has the smallest head in the game. I mean, her head hitbox at least. If we look at it from the side and the back, you can see her collar blocks a lot of it. So yeah, amongst, targetable parts of her head, she has the smallest amount of surface area. Who would have thought? Everything else looks quite normal. Moving on. For Pharah, what's interesting is that her wing hitbox is completely outlined and targetable, even between the gaps. Unlike Mercy, for example, which you'll see later, that has her hitbox true to its actual shape. This is probably why it always feels easier to shoot a Pharah out the sky instead of Mercy. More on her later. Reaper's hitbox is also ginormous. I mean, look at this thing up front and that giant targetable space underneath his arms, even though he has them lifted up. His skinny arms, however, are the exception, and the hitbox matches it to the size correctly. For Soldier, his hitbox stays quite close to its correct character model size, but his legs are a little more forgiving, likely to account for the motion when he actually starts sprinting in-game. His gun is not part of the hitbox, and his head is actually quite large relative to his size as well. Moving on to Sombra, her body hitbox and legs are way bigger than they appear, making her relatively easy to hit from the front and back. Her arms, however, have the hitbox shrunk to its true size. Looking at her head hitbox, seems pretty close to the character model. Not much to say about this one. For Symmetra, oh man, look at this gigantic hitbox on her legs, torso, and head compared to her character model. Her arms, however, like many of the other DPS heroes, have it true to the correct size, which is good, and her gun isn't part of it as well. Many people in the community find Torb's hitbox really easy to hit, and that's because he's short, with a gigantic head hitbox that's paired with parts of his exhaust pipe right beside it. So like the other easy to hit hitboxes, if you miss the head, you're almost guaranteed to at least tag his body. For Tracer, her body hitbox is actually quite large when looking at it like this. Her head rests alone at the top, but unlike Torb and some tanks, she doesn't have any part of her body beside it, so headshotting her is actually quite difficult, especially when you consider her mobility and blinks and recall. Her arms are quite true to its size, and yeah, that's it. When I first saw this Widow hitbox, even I was surprised at how big her head is relative to the rest of her body. It doesn't look like her ponytail and gun are part of the hitbox, and that's about it. Just watch this graphic spin. Now that we've done all the DPS heroes individually, let's bring them all together with their orthographic version to compare and contrast them and see which hitbox is the largest, smallest, and who's got a big head, small head, 4 head, 5 head. As we mentioned earlier, Mei overall has the smallest head surface area, but you have to consider all the viewing angles. So from a frontal view, obviously Mei's head isn't the smallest. Based on my naked eye, the smallest hitbox totally looks like Sombra, and the biggest one belongs to Torb. Moving on to supports, we have Ana's hitbox here. Her head hitbox is quite big, but her body hitbox is really small. Her body hitbox is very true to her actual character model, which is quite the opposite compared to other characters we've seen, such as McCree's. This might partially be why a lot of players complain about Ana's hitbox being difficult or wonky, especially while she's moving and strafing in real game situations. Baptiste's hitbox is very small as well. It stays quite true to his upper body, but the leg hitbox does extend quite a bit. He's got bad posture, so you won't be able to effectively nail his head from behind, so keep that in mind. For Brig, her hitbox is similar to many characters in the game we've seen so far, with the torso being the wide part to account for under the armpits. And while it seems like her mace and shield are not part of it while stationary, that changes when her shield goes up. This is a very last minute rough render of what the shield hitbox looks like. I spoke to Plus or Minus, he whipped this up for me at the last second, so if you want to see a more updated one in the future and other parts of the project, subscribe to him once again. The takeaway from it is that the shield hitbox is very accurate to its true visual model, so you won't be fooled or have any bullets blocked by just slightly shooting past it. For Lucio, his hitbox is quite a bit larger than his actual character model, but don't be fooled. His wall riding and mobility make him a lot harder to shoot in real game situations. His hair and gun are not part of the hitbox. For Mercy, her body hitbox is relatively standard to how we've seen the other ones. The coolest thing though is that her hitbox on the wing is actually true to its shape, instead of being like a giant rectangle as most would assume. When using Valkyrie, the flames that come out are not part of the hitbox whatsoever, so don't be fooled by it when trying to shoot her down. Also, it's not obvious, but according to Plus or Minus, Valkyrie does expand her 12 wing hitboxes by 10% more in thickness and in length, which is quite an interesting find. Moira's hitbox is long and narrow, but very large along her arms and shoulders. This extended part of her sleeve is not part of it, which is quite deceptive. Finally, we have Zenyatta's hitbox, which is actually humongous considering his player model size. No gaps, just a large blob on the body and a huge head hitbox, which explains why it's so easy to one-clip him on Tracer, for example, because none of your pellets can really miss underneath his arms or legs or anything. In Zenyatta's and Transcendence, his body hitbox is still very large along with his small hitbox on his arms. Obviously, you can't do any damage to him, so why are we even showing hitbox data on this? Well, it might be important for maybe Roadhog players because Zenyatta in Trance is still CCable, so you can still boop or hook him, for example. So let's throw all the supports together in this orthographic view. Pretty cool, right? According to the data, Baptiste has the smallest head hitbox surface area amongst all the supports. But from a frontal view, it looks like Lucio has the smallest head hitbox and Zenyatta has the biggest one. And to wrap things up, here's all the orthographic hitboxes all together. Thank you so much once again to Plus or Minus. Can we thank Mr. Plus or Minus in the comments, guys? Any sort of feedback at all is appreciated, and that's it. I'll see you guys next time.